What happened in Riyadh yesterday afternoon marks the official end of the American superpower. We are no longer talking about theoretical economics. We are talking about a hostile realignment unfolding in real time. Less than 24 hours ago, the Saudi Foreign Ministry informed the U.S. State Department that the lease for the naval support facilities in the Red Sea would not be renewed. Simultaneously, almost to the minute, Aramco announced it would begin accepting yuan for 100% of its oil exports to China, effective immediately. The petrodollar didn't just die, it was executed on live television. And the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the guarantor of our power in the Middle East for 50 years, has just been told it is no longer welcome in the waters it used to own. The White House is paralyzed. They are trying to spin this as a routine diplomatic adjustment, but that is a lie. This is the most significant geopolitical catastrophe since the fall of the Soviet Union. Only this time, we are the ones collapsing. I have spent the last 12 hours reviewing intelligence reports from the Gulf, and the picture is far darker than anything reported in the mainstream news. We aren't just losing an ally. We are seeing the formation of a military and economic blockade against the United States. The Chinese Navy isn't just visiting the Gulf. They are moving into the berths we just vacated. Russian S-500 missile batteries are being unloaded at airfields where American F-15 seconds used to patrol. Make no mistake, the American era in the Middle East ended last night. And the economic tsunami this is going to trigger, the inflation, the collapse of the bond market, the destruction of middle-class savings, is going to hit the American homeland within weeks. Let me break down exactly how Washington's arrogance caused this disaster, and why the Saudi betrayal is actually a wound we inflicted on ourselves. I have spent my entire academic life studying the tragedy of great power politics. I have analyzed how empires rise, assert their dominance, and inevitably overreach and collapse. But nothing in the last century compares to the catastrophic shift that just occurred in the Arabian Peninsula. We are witnessing the funeral of the American empire. It didn't happen with a nuclear explosion. It didn't happen with a troop landing in California. It happened in a quiet, air-conditioned boardroom in Riyadh, where the United States was effectively evicted from the global financial order. Most Americans don't realize that the money in their bank accounts, the value of their homes, and the stability of their retirement funds were all underpinned by a single geopolitical contract. The U.S. provides security in the Persian Gulf, and Gulf oil is priced in dollars. That contract created an artificial demand for our currency, allowing us to live beyond our means for decades. It allowed us to fund an 800-base military empire on credit. It allowed us to run trillion-dollar deficits without hyperinflation. That privilege is gone. What we are seeing now is the consequences of liberal hegemony colliding with reality. Washington believed it could weaponize the dollar against Russia, sanction Iran into oblivion, and threaten Saudi Arabia with moral lectures, all while expecting them to remain loyal subjects. It was a delusion of staggering proportions. And now, the chickens are coming home to roost. The pivot we are seeing is not just economic. It is a total strategic realignment. Intelligence reports indicate that Chinese naval assets are being granted docking rights in ports that were once exclusive to the U.S. Navy. Russian air defense systems are replacing American Patriots. The United States Fifth Fleet, sitting in Bahrain, is no longer the guardian of the Gulf. It is a hostage in hostile waters. We have lost the Middle East. And because we lost the Middle East, we are about to lose the dollar. And when the dollar goes, the American way of life goes with it. To understand the gravity of this disaster, you have to understand the history that Washington has forgotten. In 1945, the United States was the world's manufacturer. We earned our dominance. But by 1971, we were running deficits. We detached the dollar from gold. We needed a new anchor. We found it in oil. The deal was elegant in its simplicity. We told the House of Saud that we would keep them on the throne and protect them from Israel, from Iran, from internal dissent. In exchange, they would ensure that every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world is paid for in U.S. dollars. This forced every nation on earth, China, Japan, and Europe, to hoard dollars. It gave us a global credit card with no limit, but power breeds arrogance, and absolute power breeds absolute stupidity. After the Cold War ended, American policymakers became intoxicated with their own success. They stopped viewing the dollar as a public good and started viewing it as a weapon of war. This is where the tragedy begins. I want to be clear about this, because it is the most crucial point for understanding our current predicament. The United States government broke the contract first. We decided that we could use the financial system, the SWIFT network, and our reserve currency status as a bludgeon to force other sovereign nations to obey our political dictates. I watched with horror as administration after administration, Democrat and Republican, began using the financial system to crush geopolitical rivals. We cut Iran off from SWIFT. We sanctioned Venezuela's central bank. We seized Afghanistan's sovereign reserves. But the fatal blow, the decision that historians will look back on as the suicide note of the American empire, came in 2022. When we froze $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets, we crossed a Rubicon. We told the world that their money is not theirs, it is ours, and we will take it if you disobey us. I warned at the time that this was a strategic blunder of the highest order. You cannot tell the Global South that their savings are safe only as long as they follow Washington's orders. Sovereignty matters, survival matters. The Saudis watched what we did to Russia. The Chinese watched. The Indians watched. And they all reached the same conclusion. The dollar is a trap. It is essential to understand the psychology of the leadership in Riyadh. For decades, they viewed the United States as a reliable protector. But then they saw us abandon Mubarak in Egypt. They saw us negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran behind their backs. They saw us withdraw chaotically from Afghanistan. And finally, they saw us seize the assets of a significant nuclear power, Russia. They realized that the United States is no longer a partner. It is a predator. And in the anarchic world of international relations, when you identify a predator, you look for a new protector. This is where China enters the equation. While Washington was busy lecturing Riyadh about human rights and threatening to turn it into a pariah state, Beijing was offering respect. Beijing was offering infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative. And most importantly, Beijing was offering a market for their oil that did not come with political strings attached. The genius of the Chinese strategy was to recognize that the United States had overplayed its hand. We assumed that the Saudis had nowhere else to go. We thought that our military protection was indispensable, but we failed to realize that the balance of military power has shifted. And this brings me to the military dimension of this crisis, which is perhaps even more terrifying than the economic one. The United States Navy has dominated the Persian Gulf for 70 years. We treated it like an American lake. We believed that no other power could project force into that region. That assumption is now dead. The weapon systems that are currently being offloaded in Saudi ports change the calculus of war fundamentally. We are talking about Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles, also known as carrier killers. We are talking about Russian hypersonic systems, such as the Zircon. These are weapons against which the United States Navy has no effective defense. Think about what this means for the Fifth Fleet. Our aircraft carriers, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, are floating cities with 5,000 American sailors on board. They cost $13 billion to build. And yet, in the face of these new missile threats, they are sitting ducks. If a conflict were to break out today, the Chinese and the Saudis could deny us access to the Persian Gulf within hours. They could sink our carriers before we could even launch a sortie. The era of American naval supremacy is over, and with it, our ability to control the global energy supply is over. For decades, we held a knife to the throat of the Chinese economy. If you cross us, we will blockade the Strait of Malacca and cut off your oil. Now, the tables have turned. By aligning with Russia and Saudi Arabia, China has secured its energy overland. They have built a fortress in Eurasia that is immune to American naval power. We can no longer threaten them, but they can threaten us. The media will not tell you this, but the Pentagon knows it. I have spoken to officers who are terrified of the new reality. They know that if they are ordered to sail into the Gulf to restore the status quo, they are sailing into a death trap. This is why the response from Washington has been so muted. You see the president making vague statements about partnership, but you don't see any action. Why? Because we have no good options. We cannot invade Saudi Arabia. That would be insanity. We cannot sanction them effectively because they can simply sell their oil to China and India, and we cannot threaten them militarily because they now possess the weapons to sink our fleet. We are checkmated. The hegemon has been humiliated in its own backyard. But let's talk about what this means for you, the American citizen. Because while the geopolitical maneuvers might seem abstract, the economic consequences will be visceral and immediate. The standard of living that Americans have enjoyed since World War II was not a result of our productivity alone. It was a result of the dollar's exorbitant privilege. Because the world needed dollars to buy oil, they had to buy our debt. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds by the trillion. This allowed the U.S. government to borrow money at rock-bottom interest rates. It allowed us to fund Social Security, Medicare, the military, and our massive bureaucracy without raising taxes to realistic levels. We have been living on a credit card that the rest of the world was paying off. That credit card has just been canceled. When Saudi Arabia stops pricing oil in dollars, the global demand for the dollar collapses. Central banks around the world, from Brazil to Indonesia to South Africa, will no longer need to hold trillions of dollars in reserve. They will start dumping them. And when trillions of dollars come flooding back into the United States economy, the result is basic math. The supply of dollars rises, the value of the dollar falls. We are looking at an inflationary spiral that will make the inflation of the 1,970 seconds look like a period of stability. We are talking about hyperinflation. Imagine going to the gas station and seeing the price at $15 a gallon. Imagine going to the grocery store and paying $20 for a loaf of bread. Imagine your life savings, the money you worked 40 years to accumulate, losing half its purchasing power in a matter of months. This is not fear-mongering. This is the historical norm for empires that lose their status as reserve currencies. It happened to the British. It happened to the Dutch. And now, thanks to the incompetence of our foreign policy elite, it is happening to us. The U.S. government is currently $36 trillion in debt. We are adding $1 trillion to that debt every 90 days. Who is going to buy that debt now? The Chinese? No, they are dumping our bonds. The Saudis? No, they are buying gold. The Japanese? They are struggling to prop up their own currency. There is no one left to buy the debt except the Federal Reserve. And the only way the Federal Reserve can buy the debt is by printing money. This is the doom loop. The more money they print, the higher inflation goes. The higher inflation goes, the higher interest rates must go. The higher the interest rates go, the more the interest payments on the national debt explode. We are currently paying more in interest on our debt than we pay for our entire defense budget. Soon, we will be paying more in interest than we pay for Social Security. The math simply does not work. The system is insolvent. And the Saudi pivot was the pin that popped the bubble. This economic collapse will tear the fabric of American society apart. We are already a deeply polarized nation. We are already at each other's throats over cultural issues, over politics, over history. Now, imagine throwing a catastrophic economic depression into that mix. When people cannot afford to heat their homes, cannot afford to drive to work, and see their retirement accounts evaporate, they get angry. They look for scapegoats. We are looking at the potential for genuine civil unrest, for the breakdown of law and order in American cities. The foreign policy establishment, the people who sit in think tanks in Washington, D.C., and write papers about the rules-based international order, they have no idea what they have unleashed. They thought they were playing a game of chess on a global board. They didn't realize that they were gambling with the life savings of the American people, and they lost. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. That is the part that keeps me up at night. If we had simply followed a policy of restraint, if we had simply accepted that we cannot run the world, we could have maintained a balanced relationship with the Gulf. We could have coexisted with a rising China. We could have integrated Russia into Europe's security architecture instead of expanding NATO to its doorstep. We had all the advantages. We had the geography. We had the resources. We had the alliances. But we threw it all away because of hubris. We threw it away because of a fanatical belief in liberal hegemony, the idea that the United States has a God-given right to tell every other nation how to live. I remember warning back in the 1,990 seconds that NATO expansion would lead to disaster. I was ignored. I remember warning that the invasion of Iraq would destabilize the Middle East. I was ignored. I remember warning that weaponizing the dollar would lead to de-dollarization. I was ignored. The foreign policy blob in Washington is incapable of learning from its mistakes because it is incapable of admitting it makes them. Even now, as reports flood in from Riyadh and Chinese warships dock in Jeddah, the State Department spokesman is standing at the podium talking about our shared values. It is delusional. It is the behavior of a ruling class that has completely lost touch with reality. They are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while the ship is already halfway underwater. What we need to do now, if we want to salvage anything from this wreckage, is to face the brutal truth. The American century is over. The unipolar moment is gone. We are now living in a multipolar world where other great powers can say no to us. We need to stop acting like the world's policemen and start acting like a normal country. We need to rebuild our industrial base at home instead of fighting wars abroad. We need to stabilize our currency by balancing our budget, not by printing trillions of dollars. We need to treat other nations with respect, recognizing their security interests, instead of threatening them with sanctions every time they disagree with us. But I fear that Washington is incapable of this pivot. I fear that they will double down. I fear that, faced with the loss of the petrodollar, they will lash out militarily. They will look for a pretext to start a war, believing that war can restore our economic dominance. This would be the final, fatal mistake. A war with the China-Russia-Saudi axis is not a war we can win. It is a war that would likely escalate to the nuclear threshold. It is a war that would destroy what is left of the global economy. And yet, when I listen to the rhetoric coming out of Congress, when I hear senators calling for strikes on Iran, calling for confrontation with China, I see a political class that is sleepwalking into Armageddon. They do not understand that the correlation of forces has shifted. They are still living in 1991. They do not realize that in 2025, the United States is an empire in decline, overstretched, bankrupt, and internally divided. The Saudi decision to join the East is the final signal. It is the canary in the coal mine. It is telling us that the smart money, the sovereign wealth funds that manage trillions of dollars, have decided that the future belongs to Asia, not to the West. They have bet against us. And unless we radically change course, unless we abandon the failed ideology of liberal hegemony and return to a foreign policy based on realism and national interest, they will be right. The collapse of the dollar will be the collapse of American society as we know it. The supermarkets with empty shelves, the gas stations with no fuel, the banks with closed doors, these are not scenes from a dystopian movie. They are the probable future of a nation that destroyed its own currency in pursuit of global domination. The clock is ticking. The Fifth Fleet is trapped. The gold is moving to Moscow. The oil is trading in yuan. The world is changing, and we are being left behind. The only question that remains is whether the American people will wake up and demand accountability from the leaders who brought us to this precipice, or whether we will quietly slip into the long night of imperial decline. The evidence from history is not encouraging. Empires rarely reform themselves. They usually crash. And looking at the events of the last 24 hours in Riyadh, the crash has already begun. But we need to go deeper. It is not enough to simply say the empire is crashing. We need to map out exactly how the wreckage will fall, because the specific mechanics of this collapse will determine who survives and who does not. Most people see the Saudi pivot as a headline. I look at it and see the dismantling of the entire post-World War II security architecture piece by piece. Let's look at the military dimension in the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the rubber meets the road. For 50 years, the United States Navy has guaranteed the free flow of oil through that narrow choke point. We told the world, we will keep the strait open, and in exchange, you play by our rules. That was the bargain. But with Saudi Arabia and Iran now aligned under Chinese protection, the U.S. Navy is no longer the guarantor of security. We are the intruder. Consider the nightmare scenario that Pentagon war planners are sweating over right now. If Washington decides to push back, if we choose to interdict a Chinese tanker carrying Saudi oil paid for in yuan, what happens? In the past, we assumed Iran would mine the strait, and we would sweep the mines. But now, an interdiction of a Chinese vessel is an act of war against the combined capabilities of the Eurasian bloc. We would not just be facing Iranian speedboats, We would be facing Saudi shore-based anti-ship batteries, batteries that we sold them integrated into a Russian radar network. We are talking about a kill zone. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. In the age of hypersonic missiles, that is not a sea lane, it is a shooting gallery. If the Fifth Fleet attempts to enforce a blockade, or even a patrol that the Saudis deem hostile, the volume of fire that can be directed at our ships from both the Iranian and Arabian coastlines is saturating. The Aegis combat system is the best in the world, but it has a mathematical limit. If you fire 200 missiles at a destroyer that can only track 100 targets, the math is brutal. The ship sinks. This is why the aircraft carrier, the symbol of American might, has become the albatross of American strategy. We have 11 of them. Losing just one would be a psychological blow greater than 9/11. It would signal to Japan, South Korea, and Australia that the American security umbrella is full of holes, and do not think for a second that Beijing and Moscow do not know this. Their entire military doctrine for the last 20 years has been designed for precisely this moment, to create a zone of death in the near seas that makes it too expensive for the Americans to intervene. The Saudi betrayal closes the loop. It gives them the geography they needed to lock us out of the region entirely. But the damage isn't limited to the Middle East. We have to look at Europe. This is the second shoe that is about to drop, and almost nobody in Washington is talking about it. Europe is already deindustrializing because we cut them off from cheap Russian gas. We told the Germans, don't worry, you don't need Russian pipelines. You can buy LNG from the Middle East. We promised them that the Saudis and Qataris would make up the shortfall. Well, look at the board now. If Saudi Arabia is prioritizing energy sales to China and Yuan, where does that leave Europe? It leaves them freezing in the dark. The Europeans are now at the back of the line. The energy that was supposed to save the German manufacturing sector is heading east to Shanghai, not west to Hamburg. This is the death knell for NATO. You cannot maintain a military alliance when the economic interests of the members are opposed. Within 12 months, we will see European leaders breaking ranks with Washington. They will have no choice. They cannot let their populations freeze and their factories rust just to satisfy American vanity. We will see Germany, France, and Italy quietly approaching the BRICS alliance, hat in hand, begging for energy contracts. And the price of admission will be the rejection of American leadership. NATO will not end with a formal declaration. It will end with a whimper, as member states simply stop answering the phone when Washington calls. We are watching the dissolution of the Western alliance system, driven by the complex reality of energy economics, and this brings us back to the financial weapon, the mechanism that will ultimately break the American domestic economy, gold. You noticed in the reports that Saudi Arabia is repatriating its gold reserves. This is not a coincidence. It is a preparation. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE are not just trading in local currencies. They are building a new reference currency, likely backed by a basket of commodities and gold. For 50 years, the US dollar was backed by faith and credit. But faith is evaporating, and our credit is maxed out. The Eurasian bloc is moving back to hard assets. Why? Because in a world of distrust, in a realist world, you do not trust a rival's paper currency. You trust physical reality, gold, oil, wheat, minerals. When the new BRICS currency unit is unveiled, likely tied to gold, it will offer the world something the dollar cannot, a store of value that cannot be inflated away by a central bank. Imagine you are a sovereign wealth fund in Brazil or Indonesia. You have two choices. You can hold U.S. Treasury bonds, which lose value each year due to inflation and can be frozen if you anger Washington. Or you can have a gold-backed instrument that pays a yield and is outside the control of the U.S. State Department. It is not a difficult choice. This is the mechanism of the dollar's collapse. It won't be overnight. It will be what Ernest Hemingway said about bankruptcy. Gradually, then suddenly. We are in the gradual phase. The sudden phase begins when the bond auctions fail. The U.S. Treasury has to sell billions of dollars of debt every week just to keep the lights on. We rely on foreigners to buy that debt. When they stop, and they are stopping, the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort. Let's play that scenario out. The Fed prints another $5 trillion to buy the unsold debt. Inflation spikes to 20%. The Fed raises interest rates to fight inflation. The economy crashes. Tax receipts plummet. The deficit explodes even more. So the Fed prints more money. It is a death spiral. And unlike 2008, we cannot bail ourselves out because the rest of the world is no longer willing to subsidize our mistakes. The impact on American society will be transformative. We have grown used to a world where we can consume more than we produce. We buy cheap goods from China and affordable energy from the Middle East, and we pay for them with paper slips. That arrangement is a historical anomaly. It is over. We are going to have to relearn the hard lesson that wealth is not printed, it is produced. Capital from fleeing the country. You will see limits on how much cash you can withdraw. You will see restrictions on moving your money abroad. We are already witnessing surveillance infrastructure being put in place amid talk of a central bank digital currency, CBDC. Do not mistake this for innovation. It is desperation. A CBDC allows the government to trap your liquidity within the system to prevent the bank run that they know is coming. The leaders in Washington know this. Why do you think they are so desperate to ban cryptocurrencies? Why do you think they are cracking down on alternative payment systems? Because they need to close the exits. They know the theater is on fire, and they are locking the doors to keep the audience inside to prop up the system for just a few more years. It is the classic behavior of a declining empire. Rome debased its currency. The Spanish Empire defaulted on its debts. The British Empire instituted capital controls. The United States is not exceptional. We are just the latest chapter in an old story. We ignored the laws of economics and strategy, believing our own propaganda about being the indispensable nation. But in the harsh light of the Arabian sun, we are seeing that we are quite dispensable. The world is moving on. The trade routes of the 21st century are being laid down between Shanghai and Dubai, between Moscow and Mumbai. The Silk Road is being rebuilt, and it bypasses New York entirely. So, what happens next? The most dangerous period is the next 24 to 36 months. As the reality of this encirclement sets in, the panic in Washington will reach fever pitch. There will be calls for decisive action. You will hear politicians arguing that we must confront the new axis. They will talk about freedom and democracy, but they will mean power and control. If we listen to them, if we launch a kinetic war to save a financial empire, we will lose not just our economy, but our civilization. A war with the Eurasian bloc is a war against the world's industrial capacity. We cannot outproduce them. We cannot outmaneuver them on their own terrain. Offensive realism dictates that you do not pick a fight you cannot win. The prudent course, the only course, is to accept the contraction, to bring the troops home, to rebuild the republic and let the empire go. But empires rarely commit suicide gracefully. They usually lash out. And that is why I'm more worried today than I was during the height of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had a stable adversary and a stable system. Today, we have a crumbling system and a panicked leadership class that sees its power evaporating by the hour. The events in Saudi Arabia are not just a business deal. They are a judgment on 30 years of hubris, a judgment on a foreign policy that preferred coercion to cooperation. The verdict is in, and the sentence is being carried out. The dollar is dying, the fleet is stranded. And the American people are about to experience the harsh correction that history imposes on those who refuse to learn its lessons. The question is no longer, how do we stop it? The question is, how do we survive it? And the first step in survival is acknowledging the truth. The world we knew yesterday is gone. The new world is here, and it does not take American Express.